And so the thing is, the assumptions that were made when these things were built are changing, and they're no longer valid. It's the same thing with all of the levees and the water management systems and the dams and all of that kind of thing. The assumptions for the future are, the future climate is going to be different than the assumptions upon which they were designed. And it's not that that new climate is going to be necessarily bad in any sense. It's just going to be different. And so it can break the infrastructure, and it has consequences as a result. I mean, that's my perspective on it, because, after all, we have these changes that occur naturally over time, but they evolve slowly, and we can adjust to them as they go along. Any more questions? Yes?
One question, I hope it won't take too long. I've been talking about several of these issues with my students, and I have several students in here all this week, and one thing I was not able to adequately explain are some of the inconsistencies in precipitation modeling, especially in the United States. We looked at the Hadley model, and we looked at some of the same diagrams we had in here tonight, and I was wondering if we could possibly, if you could shed some light on those issues, and also the current drought. Is it a sign of what is likely to come? I know it has a historical analog in the early 1950s. So just some of these issues, these are things I couldn't explain very well.
The models are more challenged to do precipitation reliably and certainly replicate what has happened than they are to do things like temperature. And part of it relates to something I touched on very briefly, the fact that precipitation is not a continuous variable, but it's very intermittent. And so the issues with precipitation are not just the amount, but also the frequency and the intensity and the duration and the type, whether it's snow or rain and things like that. And so what we expect, things that are robust in the future, is that water vapor increases in the atmosphere. So when we do get precipitation, we expect that it's going to rain harder. But the total amount of energy that's increasing is going up at around about 2% per decade, 2% per decade, as opposed to 2% per degree increase in temperature, as opposed to about a 7% increase in terms of the water holding capacity of the atmosphere. And so there are some fundamental physical constraints on what can happen. What it says is that we expect the intensity of precipitation to go up, and this applies also to hurricanes, but that they have to be, in some sense, fewer and farther between, which means in between rainfall events there's a greater risk of drought. Things dry out, but then when you do get rainfall, suddenly you get inundated and you have too much of a good thing, you have flooding, which is why water management, I think, is one of the main challenges in the future. Seattle is just looking at this right now with major flooding and really heavy, in Seattle it rains almost every, 70% of the time in winter. They're used to rain, but they're used to light rain, not this really heavy stuff. And so the character of precipitation is changing. I think that's one of the things which is more robust from model to model, and in terms of the intensity and the frequency is likely to go down. So when you get a storm, they can be bigger, more intense storms, but they may peter out a little bit quicker, and there may be a little bit longer duration before the next storm comes along, increasing the risk of a dry period in between. And if you're unlucky and the storm just misses you, so next thing you know, you've got a local drought, and that, if it's a big area with things like El Niño's coming along, or La Niña right now, I mean, the prospects in the southeastern parts of the United States are that it's going to be dry through till next March because of the La Niña. The storm track has shifted northwards as a whole, so you'll get the occasional cold front that will come down and give you a little bit, but for the most part, it's expected to be dry here through to next March. What else was there? The current drought, So part of it is related to things like the current La Niña conditions that are going on. But it's more than that. It is certainly tied to the overall atmospheric circulation, where the jet stream is, where the storm tracks are going, and so on. There was, in the middle of the country, we had some storms, and there were a couple of hurricanes that went in and doused Texas and up through the middle of the country, but out in the west and in the southeast, it missed those storms, and now the La Nina conditions are prevailing and expected to hold sway in the during the winter time, and so the prospects are not good, and people should plan accordingly.